What if everything you thought you knew about Christianity, becoming the official religion of Rome, was a lie? What if the emperor who supposedly converted an entire empire to Christianity never actually converted himself until the very last moment? And what if I told you that on his deathbed, Constantine the Great, the most powerful man in the world, was baptized by a heretic that the church had condemned? This isn't conspiracy theory. This is history. And the truth is so much stranger than what they teach you. The man who changed Christianity forever might have been playing the greatest political game in history. Today, we're uncovering the deathbed secret that historians have debated for 1,700 years. Buckle up, because what you're about to discover will make you question everything you thought you knew about how Christianity conquered Rome. Stay with me to the end, because the final revelation will absolutely blow your mind. Who was Constantine? Before we dive into the deathbed mystery, you need to understand who Constantine was. Because this wasn't just any emperor. This was a man who literally changed the course of Western civilization. Constantine was born around 272 AD in what is now Serbia. His father, Constantius, was a Roman military commander who eventually became one of the co-emperors in the complex system Rome had developed called the Tetrarchy, basically 4 rulers sharing power to manage the massive empire. His mother, Helena, was either an innkeeper's daughter or a barmaid, depending on which ancient source you believe. She wasn't nobility. She wasn't royalty. She was common folk. This matters because Constantine's rise to absolute power was not guaranteed. He had to fight for it, literally. When his father died in 306 AD in the city of York in Britain, Constantine was proclaimed emperor by his father's troops. But here's the thing, there were other claimants to power. Rome at this time was in chaos. Multiple generals and nobles were claiming the title of emperor. Civil war was inevitable. Constantine spent the next 18 years fighting to consolidate power. He defeated rival after rival. He outmaneuvered political opponents. He made strategic alliances and broke them when convenient. This was a man who understood power politics at the highest level. He wasn't a philosopher. He wasn't a theologian. He was a warrior and a politician. And then came the moment that would change everything. The Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. Constantine was marching on Rome to face his rival Maxentius. According to the story that would become legendary, Constantine had a vision the night before the battle. He saw a cross of light in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Another version says he had a dream where Christ appeared to him and told him to mark his soldiers' shields with a Christian symbol. The next day, Constantine's army won a decisive victory. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber River trying to flee. Constantine entered Rome triumphant. And from that moment on, he attributed his victory to the Christian God. This is the story that most people know. Constantine saw a vision, converted to Christianity, and then made Christianity the official religion of Rome. End of story, right? Wrong. That's where the simple narrative falls apart. Because what Constantine actually did after this vision is far more complicated than what he supposedly believed. Constantine's actual religious policy. Here's where things get fascinating. After his victory at Milvian Bridge, Constantine didn't immediately convert to Christianity. He didn't get baptized. He didn't renounce the traditional Roman gods. What he did do was issue the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, which granted religious tolerance throughout the empire. Let me be clear about what this meant. Constantine didn't make Christianity the only legal religion. He made it a legal religion. Christians who had been persecuted on and off for nearly 300 years could now worship openly without fear. But pagans could also continue their traditional practices. Jews could continue their worship. It was religious pluralism, not religious monopoly. And Constantine himself? He continued to mint coins with images of the sun god, Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, a pagan deity that had been popular in Rome. He retained his title as Pontifex Maximus, which was the chief priest of the traditional Roman religion. He participated in pagan rituals and ceremonies. He dedicated monuments to pagan gods. Does this sound like a man who had a genuine conversion experience? Here's what makes it even more interesting. Constantine also started favoring Christianity in very concrete ways. He exempted Christian clergy from certain taxes. He returned confiscated church property. He funded the construction of massive churches, including the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He gave the church legal authority to settle certain disputes. He made Sunday, the Christian day of worship, a public holiday, though notably, he called it the Venerable Day of the Sun, which could appeal to both Christians and sun worshippers. So what was he doing? Was he a genuine believer who was moving slowly to avoid alienating his pagan subjects? Or was he a calculating politician who saw Christianity as a useful tool for unifying and controlling a fragmenting empire? The answer is, we honestly don't know for certain. And that's what makes this story so compelling. What we do know is that Constantine involved himself in Christian affairs in unprecedented ways. He called church councils. He intervened in theological disputes. He exiled bishops he disagreed with. He acted as though he had authority over the church, even though he wasn't baptized and wasn't technically a Christian in the full sense. Think about how wild that is. Imagine a political leader today who isn't a member of a religion, but who calls religious councils, decides which theological positions are correct, and has the power to exile religious leaders who disagree with him. That's essentially what Constantine did. The Arian controversy. To understand Constantine's deathbed baptism, you need to understand the biggest religious controversy of his time, the Arian controversy. This wasn't some minor theological debate. This was a battle for the very soul of Christianity, and Constantine was right in the middle of it. Here's the issue in simple terms. A priest named Arius from Alexandria started teaching that Jesus, while divine, was not equal to God the Father. He argued that Jesus was created by the Father and was therefore subordinate to him. Essentially, Arius was saying that there was a time when the Son did not exist. On the other side, you had theologians like Athanasius who argued that Jesus was co-eternal with the Father, of the same substance, fully equal. They said that if Jesus wasn't fully God, then salvation didn't work because only God could save humanity, and Jesus accomplished salvation. This might sound like splitting hairs to modern ears, but in the 4th century, this was everything. This defined what Christianity even was. Were Christians monotheists who believed in one God, with Jesus as a special creation? Or were they believing in something more complex, a Trinity where Father, Son, and Holy Spirit were somehow distinct yet one? The controversy was tearing the church apart. Different regions supported different positions. Bishops were excommunicating each other. There were riots in some cities over this question. Constantine, who valued unity above almost everything else, decided to intervene. In 325 AD, he called the Council of Nicaea, the first ecumenical council of the Christian Church. Bishops from across the empire gathered to settle the question. Constantine himself presided over the opening. He gave a speech about unity. He pressured the bishops to come to a consensus. The result was the Nicene Creed, which explicitly affirmed that Jesus was of one substance with the Father, a rejection of Arius' position. Arius and his supporters were condemned. Some were exiled. Problem solved, right? Not even close. The Arian controversy continued for decades. In fact, it got worse. The politics became incredibly complex. Bishops who had supported the Nicene position fell out of favor. Arians gained influence in Constantine's court. The emperor's own position seemed to shift. And here's the crucial detail. The man who would eventually baptize Constantine on his deathbed was an Arian bishop named Eusebius of Nicomedia. Yes, you read that right. The emperor who had presided over the council that condemned Arianism was baptized by an Arian bishop. How did that happen? To understand Constantine's religious choices, you have to understand that for him, religion was always intertwined with politics. He wasn't primarily concerned with theological correctness. He was concerned with imperial unity and stability. After the Council of Nicaea, Constantine discovered that condemning Arianism didn't make it go away. In fact, many of the most educated, articulate bishops in the eastern part of the empire were sympathetic to Arian positions, or at least to more moderate positions, between Arianism and the strict Nicene formula. These weren't fringe figures. These were influential church leaders who controlled major sees and had significant followings. Eusebius of Nicomedia was one of these figures. He was sophisticated, well-connected, and politically savvy. After being briefly exiled following Nicaea, he managed to work his way back into imperial favor. How? By convincing Constantine that the real problem was in theological difference, but stubborn bishops who refused to compromise for the sake of unity. Over time, Eusebius and other moderate to Arian bishops gained increasing influence at court. Meanwhile, staunch supporters of Nicaea, like Athanasius, found themselves out of favor. Athanasius was actually exiled 5 times during his life, partly because he absolutely refused to compromise on the Nicene position. Constantine's sister, Constantia, was also sympathetic to Arian views. On her deathbed, she reportedly recommended Eusebius of Nicomedia to her brother as a trustworthy spiritual advisor. Family influence matters, even for emperors. So by the later years of Constantine's reign, the imperial court had shifted. The emperor was surrounding himself with bishops who represented positions that the Council of Nicaea had officially rejected. This wasn't because Constantine had suddenly become an Arian. It was because he prioritized political unity over theological purity. Think about what this reveals about Constantine's character. He was willing to shift his theological alliances based on political calculations. He was willing to rehabilitate condemned bishops if they proved useful. He was willing to let theological questions remain somewhat ambiguous if that ambiguity served imperial stability. Does this sound like a man driven by deep personal faith? Or does it sound like a brilliant politician using religion as a tool of statecraft? The mystery of the unbaptized emperor. Now we come to one of the strangest aspects of Constantine's religious life. Why did he wait so long to be baptized? In the early church, baptism was seen as the moment when sins were forgiven. You were washed clean. You were made new. You entered into the covenant community. It was the defining Christian ritual. But there was also a developing belief, especially by Constantine's time, that baptism could only forgive sins committed before the baptism. Sins committed after baptism were much more serious and required intense penance. Some Christians believe that certain serious sins committed after baptism might be unforgivable. This created a practical problem. If you were baptized early in life, you had to live a rigorous, pure Christian life afterward, or you risked eternal damnation for post-baptismal sins. The solution that many people adopted, especially people in positions of power who would inevitably have to make morally compromising decisions, was to delay baptism. If you waited until you were on your deathbed to be baptized, all your sins, even the serious ones, would be forgiven, and you wouldn't have time to commit new ones afterward. It was, in a sense, a spiritual loophole. Get the benefits of Christianity without the constraints during your actual life. This practice was common enough that church leaders regularly preached against it. They warned people not to play games with their salvation. They said you couldn't just live however you wanted and then have a deathbed conversion. But people did it anyway, and Constantine was no exception. Throughout his life, Constantine made decisions that would be hard to reconcile with Christian ethics. He ordered the execution of political rivals. He had his own son, Crispus, executed on unclear charges, possibly based on false accusations. He had his second wife, Fausta, killed shortly after, possibly for making those false accusations. These weren't minor moral compromises. These were brutal political killings. Could Constantine do these things while being baptized? Technically, yes, but it would require serious penance and put his salvation at risk, according to the theology of the time. Better to remain unbaptized, do what needed to be done politically, and then receive baptism at the end. This is the pragmatic explanation for why Constantine waited. He needed the moral flexibility that being unbaptized provided. He could favor Christianity, promote the church, involve himself in theological debates, and even see himself as chosen by the Christian God all, without being bound by Christian moral constraints. But there's another possible explanation. Maybe Constantine genuinely wasn't sure what he believed. Maybe he was hedging his bets between the traditional Roman gods and the Christian God. Maybe he saw them all as different manifestations of the same divine power. Maybe he was spiritually curious, but not committed. We'll never know for certain what was in Constantine's heart, but we do know what happened in his final days. The deathbed scene. In 337 AD, Constantine became seriously ill. He was in his mid-60s, which was quite old for that era. He knew the end was near. According to the historical accounts we have, primarily from Eusebius of Caesarea, not to be confused with Eusebius of Nicomedia, though they knew each other, Constantine traveled to the suburbs of Nicomedia to a place called Arian, where he hoped the baths might restore his health. They didn't. Realizing he was dying, Constantine summoned bishops to him. Hear us what Eusebius of Caesarea recorded. Constantine declared that he had hoped to be baptized in the river Jordan, where Jesus had been baptized, but that God had decided otherwise. He would accept baptism now. The emperor removed his imperial purple robes, the symbols of his earthly power. He put on white robes, symbolizing his intention to be baptized. He made confession of his sins, and then he was baptized. Who baptized him? Eusebius of Nicomedia, the Arian bishop, the man who represented a theological position that Constantine's own council had condemned 12 years earlier. After his baptism, Constantine reportedly said he was now truly happy to be called a servant of God. He refused to put his purple imperial robes back on, remaining in his white baptismal garments. He died shortly afterward, on May 22, 337 AD. The scene raises us many questions. First, why Eusebius of Nicomedia? If Constantine wanted to be baptized in the Orthodox Nicene tradition, there were other bishops available. But he chose, or his advisors chose, an Arian bishop. Was this a final theological statement? Was it simply that Eusebius was nearby and politically influential? Was Constantine even conscious enough to choose? Second, was the baptism valid? From the perspective of the Nicene Orthodox position, being baptized by a heretic was problematic. The Church would later develop complex rules about the validity of sacraments performed by heretical clergy. But at this moment, in 337, those rules weren't yet settled. Third, did Constantine even understand what was happening? Some historians have suggested he might have been semi-conscious or delirious from illness. The baptism might have been administered more for political purposes, to ensure the Christian succession and legitimacy of his sons, and as a genuine spiritual moment. Fourth, what did Constantine actually believe in his final moments? Did he die believing he was saved by Christian baptism? Did he die uncertain? Did he die still hedging his bets between different divine powers? We simply don't have enough evidence to answer these questions definitively. And that ambiguity has fascinated historians for centuries. How history remembered Constantine after Constantine's death. Something interesting happened. Different Christian groups remembered him differently. The Nicene Orthodox Party, the bishops who held to the Creed of Nicaea, had a complicated relationship with Constantine's memory. On one hand, he had called the council that produced the Nicene Creed. He had initially supported their position. He had made Christianity legal and powerful. On the other hand, he had later rehabilitated Arian bishops. He had exiled Athanasius, their champion, and he had been baptized by an Arian. The solution? They emphasized Constantine's early support for Nicaea and downplayed or reinterpreted his later actions. They portray his baptism by Eusebius of Nicomedia as the unfortunate accident of geography and timing, not a theological statement. They focused on his role in legalizing Christianity and building churches. The Eastern Orthodox Church would eventually canonize Constantine as a saint, along with his mother Helena. They called them equal to the apostles for their role in spreading Christianity. His feast day is still celebrated. His baptism by an Arian bishop, not emphasized in the hagiographies. The Arian party, meanwhile, saw Constantine's deathbed baptism as vindication. Their theological opponents had been exiled. Their bishop had baptized the emperor. They had influence in the imperial court. For a generation after Constantine's death, Arianism actually grew in power and influence. It would take decades and eventually another church council, the Council of Constantinople in 381 AD, before Nicene Orthodoxy definitively won out over Arianism in the Roman Empire. And even then, Arianism persisted among various Germanic tribes for centuries. So Constantine's deathbed baptism had real consequences. It emboldened the Arian movement. It created ambiguity about imperial religious policy. It contributed to decades of continued theological conflict. But here's what's really interesting. Over the long arc of history, Constantine's theological ambiguities didn't matter as much as his structural changes. He had made Christianity legal. He had given the church property, wealth, and legal standing. He had established a precedent of emperors involving themselves in church affairs. Whether Constantine died a true believer, a pragmatic politician, or something in between, the effect of his reign was to transform Christianity from a persecuted minority religion into a powerful institution that would shape Western civilization. What do historians actually think? Modern historians have debated Constantine's sincerity for generations. Let me walk you through the main schools of thought. The sincere convert theory. Some historians argue that Constantine's vision before the Battle of Milvian Bridge was genuine. They point to his consistent patronage of Christianity, his personal involvement in theological disputes, and his deathbed baptism as evidence of real faith. They explain away the contradictions, his continued use of pagan imagery, his retention of pagan titles, his brutal political actions, as the messy reality of being an emperor in a transitional period. According to this view, Constantine was a genuine believer who had to navigate complex political realities while trying to move the empire toward Christianity. The pragmatic politician theory. Other historians argue that Constantine was primarily a political actor who recognized Christianity as potential, as a unifying force for a fragmenting empire. They point out that Christianity, unlike traditional Roman paganism, was highly organized, had a clear hierarchy, and could provide ideological cohesion. Constantine's conversion was strategic. His patronage of the church was transactional. He gave them power and wealth, and they provided legitimacy for his rule. His deathbed baptism was insurance, a final hedge of his bets. According to this view, Constantine used Christianity. He didn't genuinely believe it. The syncretic believer theory. A third group of historians suggests that Constantine genuinely believed in divine power but didn't sharply distinguish between the Christian God and other divine beings, particularly Sol Invictus, the sun god. In this view, Constantine saw Christianity as the supreme expression of divine truth, but didn't reject other religious traditions as completely false. His religious worldview was more inclusive and syncretic than later Orthodox Christianity would allow. His deathbed baptism reflected a final commitment to the Christian understanding of salvation, but his earlier ambiguity was sincere uncertainty, not political calculation. The unknowable interiority theory. Finally, some historians argue that we simply know what Constantine truly believed because we do and have access to his internal thoughts and motivations. All we have are his public actions and statements, which were always performed in political contexts where sincerity is impossible to determine. Trying to figure out if Constantine really converted is like trying to figure out if a modern politician really believes their campaign promises. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Maybe they believe it in the moment, but it's shaped by expediency. I personally find the evidence most consistent with the syncretic believer theory. Constantine seems to have genuinely believed in divine favor and protection. He attributed his military victories to divine intervention. He took religious questions seriously. But he also didn't see religious boundaries as sharply as later Christians would. He could honor the sun god and the Christian God without seeing them as contradictory. His deathbed baptism represented a final decisive commitment to Christianity, but not a rejection of his earlier religious ambiguity. But here's the thing, historians are still arguing about this. There are serious scholars on all sides of this debate. That tells you something important. The evidence is genuinely ambiguous. What this reveals about faith and power. Constantine's story raises profound questions that extend far beyond 4th century Rome. It forces us to think about the relationship between genuine faith and political expediency, between personal belief and public performance, between spiritual sincerity and strategic calculation. Can a person in supreme political power have genuine religious faith? Or does the exercise of power inevitably compromise spiritual authenticity? Constantine ordered executions. He crushed rivals. He made morally dubious decisions. Can someone who does these things genuinely believe they're serving God? The traditional Christian answer is yes, power doesn't preclude faith. David was a warrior king who ordered deaths and committed adultery, yet he was called a man after God's own heart. Christian theology has always acknowledged that believers are sinners, that faith doesn't equal moral perfection. From this perspective, Constantine's moral failures don't prove he lacked genuine faith. But there's another perspective. Maybe Constantine's story reveals how religion functions as a tool of power. Maybe his ambiguous conversion shows us that when religion becomes entangled with state power, sincerity becomes impossible to determine and maybe even impossible to maintain. Maybe Constantine couldn't have genuine faith precisely because he was emperor. The role demanded too much compromise. There's also the question of what counts as real conversion. Does conversion require theological understanding? Constantine involved himself in complex theological debates, but did he actually understand them? Or was he just picking sides based on which bishops seemed most useful politically? Does conversion require moral transformation? Constantine's behavior didn't dramatically change after his vision at Milvian Bridge. Does conversion require official ritual? If so, Constantine wasn't really Christian until his deathbed baptism, no matter what he believed beforehand. These aren't just academic questions. They touch on how we understand religious faith in the public square today. When politicians claim religious faith, how do we assess their sincerity? When religious institutions ally with political power, how does that change both the institution and the faith? When someone converts for seemingly pragmatic reasons, marrying into a religious family, gaining social acceptance, accessing community resources, is that conversion less valid than one that comes from private spiritual experience? Constantine's story doesn't give us clear answers, but it forces us to ask the questions. Why this matters, here's what I want you to understand. The story of Constantine's deathbed baptism isn't just ancient trivia. It's a window into one of the most consequential transformations in human history. The moment when Christianity went from a persecuted minority to an imperial religion. And the truth is messy. It's ambiguous. It involves political calculation, theological controversy, personal faith, family influence, strategic maneuvering, and genuine religious devotion all mixed together in ways that can't be neatly separated. Constantine died in white baptismal robes, finally officially a Christian after decades of ambiguity. Was he saved in that moment? Different Christians have different answers based on their theology. Did he sincerely believe? We'll never know for certain. Did his conversion change history? Absolutely, unquestionably yes. The emperor who changed Christianity forever might never have been fully Christian, in the way the church would later define it. And that paradox, that tension between faith and power, between sincerity and strategy, between personal belief and historical consequence, is what makes Constantine's story endlessly fascinating. So yes, Constantine converted to Christianity on his deathbed. But what that conversion meant to him, to the church, to history, remains one of the great mysteries of ancient history. And sometimes, the most important historical truths are the ones we can't fully know. What do you think? Was Constantine's conversion real or political theater? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this video made you think differently about how Christianity became the religion of Rome, smash that like button and subscribe for more historical deep dives that challenge everything you thought you knew.